Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now let's turn to Australia and a stark warning from the United Nations about one of the world's most famous natural wonders, the Great Barrier Reef. UNESCO says it should be placed on a list of World Heritage sites that are in danger because of the effects of climate change. A UN report says Australia has not done enough to protect the reef and its status should be reviewed next month. Well, Australian officials have reacted with fury, criticising the decision and saying they'll oppose it. The Australian Environment Minister said UN experts had backflipped on previous assurances. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Arise international correspondent Faith Orr. Good to see you, Faith. Now, there have been reports for a wee while now that the Barrier Reef is suffering stress. But how surprising is it for UNESCO to come out and make the statement in the way that they have?
The downgrade is surprising because if it goes ahead, and of course Australia are opposing it, it would be the first time that a sort of natural wonder has been downgraded from the World Heritage Site to in danger. So it's surprising from that perspective, but it's not that surprising. I mean, the United Nations says Australia hasn't done enough to protect the reef over the years. Even some domestic scientific studies has said that the Australian government hasn't done nearly enough, that much more needs to be done. So in that respect, it's not that surprising a move. We have seen lots of mass bleaching events where coral has died in the past few years, and some experts are saying that the reef is actually in so much trouble that it simply can't be brought back. Just to give viewers an idea of what we're talking about, we do have some side-by-side comparisons of the images so that we can see the healthy reef and the after mass bleaching. There we go. So you can see there the difference between those two images, you know, the healthy reef on one side and then the damaged reef on the other. And that is caused by the water being too warm, and we know that sea temperatures, of course, are rising because of climate change.
That is really astonishing stuff, and I mean very, very worrying looking at those images. And it seems so clear what the problem is. Why is the Australian government so exercised by what UNESCO is saying? Because I mean, climate change is a global issue. Is it the suggestion that there is a national responsibility that's got the Aussies pretty miffed, or is it just all politics at an Australian level and the government is embarrassed by this?
The Australians feel like they're being singled out because, of course, there's reefs all over the world, although this is the one of greatest importance, but they say there's problems everywhere. They feel like they're being singled out as a target here. The report points the finger directly at the Australian government for bearing responsibility for this. But of course, climate change is a global issue, and Australia is determined that it is doing as much as it can to tackle it. They also say they were given assurances just last week that the reef would not be downgraded to this status. We can just hear from Susan Ley, who is Australia's Environment Minister.
This is a complete subversion of normal process. The Foreign Minister and I had a late night meeting with the Director General of UNESCO last night, and we made very clear our strong disappointment, even our bewilderment that our officials have been blindsided in the way that they have. The reef is an icon internationally, and we are here to fight for the reef, and we are here to challenge the decision when it comes up for final consideration in the World Heritage Committee in about the third week of July.
Heard there, Charles, the Australians not taking this line down at all. They are going to appeal the decision, they are going to challenge it, and it'll be interesting to see how UNESCO reacts to that.
Absolutely, but there's also a wider political element to this, isn't there? Because the Australian government is accusing the Chinese of being behind this. I mean, there is, of course, the geopolitical tension that simmering in the background between the two countries. China has the rotating chair of UNESCO at present. Is that Australian defection, or is there some truth to that?
So the World Heritage Committee is a 12-nation group, and it is currently chaired by China. Of course, China and Australia haven't had the best diplomatic relations in the past few years. And Australia's Environment Minister, who we did just hear from there, she also says that there is clearly politics at play in this decision, and those politics have subverted the proper process in the decision making. But this is just the latest route and part of a dispute between UNESCO and Australia over the status of this reef. It was given World Heritage ranking in 1981. I mean, it's enormous scientific importance. It's the size of Italy. It's the largest living structure on Earth. But since 2017, there have been discussions about placing it on this in danger status on the list. So it's easy for Australia to say, oh, well, this is all China, but these discussions have been ongoing for quite some time. In 2017, Canberra did commit to $2.2 billion to trying to help the reef, but many people say that just simply isn't enough. Even local environmental groups, they're saying the UN's decision is not about politics, it's because the reef needs saved and the Australian government simply isn't doing enough as it stands.
So what does UNESCO think the Australian government can do nationally? Because the report suggests that it's not just water temperature, as you pointed out, it's also water quality. That would seem to be something that a national government can actually control. Is that something that the Australian government can do at a local level that it isn't doing at the moment?
It would certainly seem so. I mean, if we go back to 2017 again, the Australian government put in place a new project to try and improve the water quality. But it didn't go to the lengths that many people wanted it to go to, which was putting limits on agriculture. So for instance, around Queensland, there's lots of agriculture, of course, it's a hugely important industry for Australia. But there have been these calls for a cap on pollution from farms which are near the Great Barrier Reef. Because what happens is that the pollution, everything comes off and it goes into the water. Now, that causes problems for the Great Barrier Reef. The spread of sediment pollutants, when that gets into the water, essentially what happens is that it smothers the coral and it can spread the growth of damaging algae. It can lower water quality even further. Then you have this sort of repeating cycle where corals are more susceptible to disease, where growth is impeded, reproduction is impeded, and it also changes the way of the food structures within the reef. So it certainly doesn't seem like the Australian government is doing enough on this. I mean, they do want, restrictions on sugarcane, grazing, other sectors. I mean, those are calls by the Queensland government locally. So it does seem like more could be done on this particular issue of water quality.
And we've still got a couple of minutes or so before we have to end the chat. Just for people in the audience who don't actually know what the barrier reef is, it's a gigantic living organism, isn't it?
I mean, as I said earlier, it is the size of Italy. Just to put that into a little bit of perspective, it can be seen from space. It is the largest living organism on the planet. So it's certainly no small thing that needs protected. And it's just vital for the world's biodiversity. I mean, tens of thousands of fish use it as their home, as a feeding source for protection. All sorts of sharks, all sorts of turtles. As we see behind me, there's all sorts of turtles rely on this reef for their very existence. So it's not just a case of corals dying out, it can affect so much else as well.
So, I mean, what are we talking about with regard to the effects of climate change? Is it about energy production and CO2 emissions? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, scientists say that the main cause of the rising sea temperatures is climate change caused by CO2 emissions, the burning of fossil fuels. Australia has been a bit of an outlier amongst especially OECD countries. They're refusing to commit to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Most recently, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, refused to commit to reducing further at the G7 summit, which was held in the UK. So they really say, and he is saying, we will get there, but how Australia does it is as important. But of course, that's the issue, because with climate change, when is every bit as important as how. And many international governments, pressure groups simply say the Australians aren't moving quickly enough on this. But there are people trying to do things.
Right.
We have seen local projects where people are trying to help this reef.
Faith, thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. Faith Orr, our international correspondent. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.